If one rejects laissez-faire on account of man's fallibility and moral weakness, one must for the same reason also reject every kind of government action. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we'll be discussing cooperation and coercion with James Harrigan. He is the managing director of the Freedom Center at University of Arizona and the F.A. Hayek Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. Mr. Harrigan, thank you so much for taking the time to do a show like this.
Glad to be here.
What is the moral or philosophical difference between cooperation and coercion?
Well, you know, it's one of those things, right, Keith? It's exactly as simple as it seems. Human beings really only have two organizing principles, right? We either cooperate with each other, and that's exactly what it sounds like. We all find a way to negotiate our way through life day to day, or we use the force of government to coerce one another. Now, on balance, of course, I'm always going to tell you that cooperation is superior. But oddly enough, I'm also going to tell you that a little bit of coercion is absolutely necessary, something that classical liberals, libertarians, more often than not, will push back on. But I think it's an unremarkable assertion when you get right down to it, right? So we ask the question, how can we foster the greatest degree of cooperation? And you have to realize that there has to be universal acceptance of a couple principles, right? Some rules of the game have to be stipulated. And if I just said something like, look, we need the power of the state, the coercive power of the state to regulate and maintain property rights, all of a sudden it starts to come into focus, right? Because we do need some apparatus to maintain property rights. It's probably going to have to be, at least in the final analysis, coercive from time to time, but that's what leaves the widest berth for cooperation, which is what we're really trying to get to.
Sure. You refer to cooperation not only being morally superior, but also having a self-correcting mechanism. What is the self-correcting mechanism of cooperation?
Well, when you think these things through, cooperation starts to look a lot like markets, right? And if you think about markets, if you offer something in a market and you get no takers, you have to alter what you're offering to make it more palatable to the rest of, well, all of humanity when it comes right down to it. So too, when we decide that we're going to live cooperatively, there has to be that gentle give and take between human beings. And when you start to think about what that looks like, the gentle give and take, it's my acting in a certain way and then responding to feedback that I get in the larger world. And sometimes that feedback is going to tell me that everybody's pretty happy with how I'm acting. So I just keep right on doing it. Other times, the message I'm going to receive is that I've made a mistake, that I'm acting in a way that people find to be unpleasant or odorous, whatever adjective you want to throw in there. And if I get that kind of feedback, I have to gently change the way that I'm behaving so I can become more cooperative, more agreeable to my fellows, right? And when you look at society writ large, this is what you see. You see people acting and reacting. And it's in that give and take that I think we find the most optimal way that we can behave as human beings, right? The way that we all come out ahead in the end. And in a lot of ways, what we're talking about here is the difference, and there is an absolute difference between society on the one hand and government on the other, right? And this is something that Americans understood all the way back to Thomas Paine, who said that society in every instance is a blessing, government is at best a necessary evil. And you start to think about it in this way, and you realize that these things balance one another actually quite nicely. And the more that we can walk the road, the social road, rather than the coercive governmental road, the happier we're all going to be in the end. And this is, I think, the central message of the book that Anthony Davies and I wrote.
What is the difference between positive rights and negative rights?
Oh, here we go. This is actually a lot more simple than people people want it to be. People want this to be very complicated, and it's not. If you think about rights, and rights are the language of politics here in the United States, right? So we're always talking about what our rights are. And I think reasonably so. But what I say when I give the talk about rights, and what I said in the book and what I'll say to you right now is always generally the same thing. I view rights the way Homer Simpson viewed alcohol. They're the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. And it makes a fair amount of sense, right? Because we approach our political discourse in the language of rights. And this is simple enough when the rights remain negative. And there's absolutely, this is not a pejorative term, it's a technical term. A negative right is the kind of right that you have prior to government, the kind of right that costs exactly nothing for someone else to respect. So typically in the United States, we think right through the Bill of Rights. And I'll just stick with the First and Second Amendments, right? These are the obvious ones. So you get the right to free speech, the right of a free press, the free exercise of religion, and the right to keep and bear arms, and peaceable assembly, or these sorts of things. How much, in terms of dollars, how much do any of those rights cost another human being that I might exercise them? And the answer is $0. Now, they may cost you something in a lot of other ways. They may be irritating to you. In the case of the Second Amendment, they may be frightening to you. And we say that these are prior to government, right? So I have the right to free speech before we enter into any sort of contract for government. That right existed prior to government, exists during the period we're under a coercive government, right? Remember how the Bill of Rights begins in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. What you're going to get there is a list of things Congress can't do. Okay, that's negative rights. Congress cannot do any of these things, which means that's a free, wide berth for the citizen. Knock yourself out. Positive rights, on the other hand, are the kind of rights that don't start with Congress shall make no law, but start more theoretically with Congress must make the following laws, right? When we talk about negative rights, we talk about freedom from, and it's freedom from the coercive power of government, right? That's always what negative rights are. They don't protect me from you, my fellow citizen. They protect me and you from our government. All right, positive rights, on the other hand, are radically different. And when you think about them, these are more along the lines not of freedom from, but of freedom to, right? The citizen is empowered by certain acts of government to enjoy any number of things that are bequeathed upon him. So when we think about positive rights, we should be thinking about things like Social Security, Medicare. You hear Bernie Sanders cranking off in the distance all the time about free college. Well, that's not free, right? Nothing is free. It's at no cost to the beneficiary, kind of like the other ones I just mentioned. And when you think about how these things work, negative rights protect you and me from our government. Well, positive rights, on the other hand, are claims some citizens make against other citizens. Right, so they're radically different in their orientation. So I am considerably older than you, judging by the looks of things on the video feed here. I can make a claim against you that I need to be cared for in my retirement, and you need to pay for that, right? And this is the nature of a positive right. Some pay for others that they may enjoy a thing that not everybody enjoys, at least not at any given point in time. And the best example here is public education, right? When you look at public education in the United States, it's absolutely a positive right. It's probably one of the biggest ones we've got that we never actually think about. And in order to benefit from public education, I'm talking K through 12 education, you have to realize a couple of things. The first thing is that the people who get to enjoy this right are roughly aged 5 to 18. I can't go to public high school anymore, right? There's a certain cap here. And we don't end up sending 1-year-olds to public school, right? This is, generally speaking, a 12, 13-year endeavor, ages 5 to 18. All right, so we've got a very limited scope at who gets to enjoy the right. Now ask the next question. How do we pay for that? And it's an interesting thing, because the knee-jerk reaction people will give when asked that question is that taxpayers pay for that. Well, that's right, but it's woefully insufficient. It doesn't really explain who pays for it. If you drill down a little deeper, you find that the lion's share of education funding in the United States comes from property taxes at the local level. Okay, so look at what we've already done here. We've separated out one group of people who enjoy the right, and then we've located a different group of people who, property owners at the local level. So these are homeowners, business owners, real estate owners, things like this. In some jurisdictions, people who own automobiles are taxed, and these are all property taxes. Why property taxes? Because this particular right, education, remarkably expensive. You've got to build these buildings. You've got to hire massive faculties. You've got to put all the books and computers and stuff in the buildings. If you think about what schools cost, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, in order to pay for that, you're going to have to find people who actually have something. You can't just apply that tax equally, right? You've got to go after people who have the money. And what's the evidence that they have the money? They've bought houses, they own businesses, they own in some places automobiles. And what you find is that negative rights cost nothing. Positive rights cost quite a lot. Negative rights yield out a very simple government. Remember, Congress shall make no law. You've got to develop a government that doesn't do specific things. That's not difficult. On the positive right side, you get remarkably complex government organizations. You get the Social Security Administration, you get the Medicare Administration, you get at the local level school boards, all these sorts of things. Because here we're talking about what government must do. And you get radically different worlds. Now, these two things cannot live in perfect consonance. You cannot have negative rights all the way down the line if you also have positive rights. Why not? Because one of your negative rights is the right to property. You go get a job, you contract with me, say, because as John Locke said, we own our own bodies. A remarkably simple assertion. Unremarkable, it's so simple. Who else could own you if not you? There were prior times in human history when this would have been quite difficult, Locke's time among them. But in our time, this is an easy thing to contend. You own your body, I own my body, which means you can use your body to labor, to work in contract with me, and I can agree to pay you for labor. Now, that means, let's just say I'm paying you $10 an hour, you're going to work 20 hours a week. That means you're going to get $200 a week from me, which is immediately your property. Why? Because you used your labor to earn it in contract with me. Okay, slow down though, because it's not exactly your property, is it? We all know that if we're doing this legally in the United States, we're both going to have to pay taxes on that. And there's your property rights violation, which means your natural rights are not absolute as far as the government is concerned. And here come all the complications, right? All the complications, theoretical and actual. They start right here. Can you have negative rights all the way down the line? Well, maybe, but you don't. Because we live in this society where it's going to be taxed. And we can take the approach that taxation is theft and wring our hands and jump up and down about it. Or we could be a lot more reasonable. And we can say, look, even under the original Constitution of 1787, there were some costs involved. And those costs are going to have to be borne somehow. And they're going to be borne by taxation. Now, the level of taxation that we needed then relative to now, much lower. But nonetheless, we did need it, if only for things like, remember, the original Constitution talks about what happens in courts of law. You're going to have to fund a court. It specifies that post offices and post roads can be built. Well, if you're going to build them, somebody's going to have to pay for them. So it's simple enough on the negative right side to realize that, well, we're going to have some costs over here no matter what we do, which means we're going to have some taxation. And if you do a little bit of digging into it, The costs on that side rough out to be more or less 2.5% to 4% of GDP on a very consistent basis. So that's what a negative rights regime costs you, because there are some costs no matter what. When you get to the positive rights regime, those costs escalate something awful. And right now we're at about 35% of GDP. And you can start to make the case that that level of taxation is confiscatory in a way that the prior level was not. But it's all because we decided once upon a time to collectivize certain things and call them rights. And it started happening in the United States, roughly speaking, about 1928. You could start to see the rates go up at that point. And by 1932, when Roosevelt takes office, it's already been happening, and it continues quite significantly from there forward. And here's where we are with rights. We want more than we're willing to pay for. Human nature. What will you do?
Well, and you can look at FDR's 4 freedoms. 2 of his 4 freedoms were freedom from fear and freedom from want. So until no one wants anything else, or no one is afraid of anything, government gets to grow and grow and grow. Even if government is the thing they're afraid of, or the thing people want to stop aggressing against them, well, then it's just how they wrote themselves this blank check. When you step back and look at it, I think it's in chapter 2 or 3 in Cooperation and Coercion by Anthony Davies and James Harrigan, our guest today. It's just so amazing that they pulled this one over. And you go into, okay, here's one that's really interesting. Any further comments on positive and negative rights?
It'll probably come up again and again and again.
Okay. So just a quick story that happened to me. Me and my roommate, it's like Sunday morning, and he goes, "Hey, man, can you hear that?" And I go, "Hear what? I've been up for an hour and I hadn't heard anything." If you're really quiet, you could hear the neighbor pounding on his roof because they're fixing their roof, making his house look nicer. I said, "Yeah, what about it?" He goes, "Oh, what the hell? It's so early. It's Sunday morning, for God's sakes." And I go, "Okay, you tiny tyrant. You're ruining God's day already for me." And then I see the police out there talking to the guy, and I go, "Excuse me, person X, roommate, why is there a cop out there?" And they called the cops on him. My roommate did. And he goes, "Well, if they had waited another 30 minutes, I wouldn't have, but, that happened to me." Now, the subtitle of this book is called How Busybodies Became Busy Bullies. So in other words, when people think they have all these entitlements and these positive rights and they don't recognize government as violence, they're so easy to use the tool of the state to coercively dominate people that are being totally peaceful. Yes, noise pollution exists, but this was so trivial, I couldn't believe it was happening. How did busybodies become busy bullies? Because I can't imagine where my roommate would have gotten that. How did this happen?
As most pernicious things, it happens slowly over time. Right? People just got it in, and you see it everywhere once you train yourself to look for it. And your roommate example is spot on, right? It's a really good one. And I'm going to resist the urge to say horrible things about him and just speak more generically. People have become less inclined over time to deal with one another as human beings. And this is a strange phenomenon that's been occurring probably for the majority of my life. I remember when I was young, when I was 3 or 4 or so, 5 or 6, you'd wander about outside in your neighborhood and you knew your neighbors. And certain patterns of behavior were expected and enforced at the very local level. So if I were doing something horrific outside, and when I was a boy, of course I did horrific things outside. All little boys do. My neighbors would sometimes look out the window and say, "Hey, knock it off. Go back in your own yard. Cut it out. I'm going to tell your mother," right? Things like this. And those are remarkably powerful things when you're young. Now, somehow, over the swath of time that is my life, we've ended up at a place where, and speaking for myself right now, I don't know a single one of my neighbors. I don't know any of them. I never see them. I don't introduce myself to them. We have nothing to do with one another. And when that becomes the norm, some other form of authority has to step in. and it becomes the coercive power of the state. So when something happens here in my neighborhood, my neighbors, given that I don't know them, it's not a big stretch to admit that they don't know me either. They're going to be more inclined to complain to an authority about my behavior than to come and directly address it with me. And we see this all the time. Just last week, you talk about noise pollution. We have something that I hate very much here, a homeowners association. And the homeowners association has an online discussion thread. And somebody posted to that thread. You can imagine the nonsense that comes out of this, right? This is the worst damn thing I can imagine. Because somebody complained that his next door neighbor was making a lot of noise after the hour of 10 p.m. And the question he had was, who can I contact to complain about this? I, of course, immediately responded, gee, I don't know, your neighbor? How about that? How about you go knock on his door and say, you're making a lot of noise. Maybe you can keep it down a little bit. And everybody thought that I was insane. That's crazy. Who would do such a thing? So what you really need to do is complain to the HOA, and they'll send a representative over there. And if that doesn't work, you have to call the police.
Huh.
Whatever happened to knocking on somebody's door and saying, look, I really can't live with this noise you're making after 10 p.m. Can you maybe pipe down a touch? Because that was just standard operating procedure a generation ago. And it no longer is. And people have learned that the more government gets involved in our lives, the more you can use it as a tool to alter the behavior of your fellow citizens. And the example we use in the book, one of the prime examples, is the soda tax from Philadelphia, right? We wrote about this a couple of times. When the busybodies in Philadelphia thought, oh, wow, people are getting too fat. Let's prohibit them from having soda. Okay, we can't prohibit it, but let's make it really expensive for them to buy this thing that very clearly they want. And let's make bigger sizes of the soda, you know, the giant mega big gulp that you get at the 7-Eleven. Let's tax that even more. By what right does any government claim to intrude, intrude into a private thing like the buying of a soda? And if you look at it, it's really at root a group of people saying, we know better than you what you should be doing. And we're going to use government to make sure you do it. And I think it comes largely because we've walked away from the relationships that we used to have, the parallel relationships that we used to have, citizen to citizen. Because when that disappears, well, now it's just people using government as a blunt force tool to get other people to behave the way they want to. And I don't think it's surprising at all that it only gets worse.
Sure. And it's the cause of a lot of strife, because let's say you want to be objective, so let's not take anything right now. If we take freedom of religion, if government runs religion, you know, just for our best interest, this way no one believes in the wrong religion. If government regulates religion and I'm a Muslim and you're an atheist and Anthony Davies is a Scientologist, we are going to be at each other's throats, constantly competing, hating one another to get the power of the state so our religion can be practiced. But when we have freedom, we're able to cooperate peacefully in a way we otherwise wouldn't be able to if the state was constantly getting involved. So it's amazing how this rhetoric of something we think of as Congress in DC has actually negatively affected all of us and just how one person treats another. Yeah, that was this. My neighbor had a big old pile of rocks on the side of his house where cars drove by. So it wasn't the front of his house where they usually are, this big old pile. And I would drive by it every day and it would piss me off. And then one day I go, why don't I say something? I've been praying for this thing to go away. Why don't I go up there? Went up, knocked on the door, said, hey, I got a shovel. Why don't you and I take care of this? I'll help you out because you haven't done it yourself. And he goes, hey, man, I really appreciate that. You know what? I do need to get rid of it. Literally the next day it was gone. So there's all these peaceful solutions. There's all these cooperative solutions. But for some reason, people's minds just go to coercion. I'm curious. You wrote something that says No policy can save lives. It can only trade lives. With regard to the current pandemic, what does that mean?
Yeah, we've been getting into this quite a lot during the recent unpleasantness, as it's become known in my mind, right? Ever since we all became prisoners under house arrest, which is, I guess, about 2 months now, more or less, right? And you get this thought, and it happens a lot, right? This is not really just directed at the pandemic. This kind of crap happens a lot. People are utterly convinced that there's a magic wand government can use to achieve certain laudable or desired outcomes. And I'm going to stipulate, unremarkably, that saving lives is a pretty good idea. And if we can do that, we probably should. Unremarkable, right? So the rejoinder that I get all the time when I talk about this in public is, why do you want old people to die? Well, for the love of God, why on earth does anybody want old people to die? Just shut up, for crying out loud, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, how can we fix things so old people die? The same way you get the argument with education too. People say, well, why don't you want good education? Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, gee, how can we fix it so children grow up to be stupid? Everybody has very similar desires in terms of ends, right? We generally want the same kinds of outcomes. People left, right, middle, classical, liberal, whatever. Everybody wants other human beings to flourish and have good lives. So that's what we have to stipulate right off the start. What we disagree on are the means where things get tricky. All right. So when we talk about policy, people seem to think that you can just declare an outcome. For example, here, we want people to be safe and healthy. Therefore, let's pass some laws that require everybody to stay indoors. Okay, people are going to be safe and healthy from whatever it is out of doors that might have gotten them. But now they're not safe from the things that might get them indoors. Right? There are all kinds of things, categories of death and unfortunate outcomes that we're now subject to that we wouldn't have been subject to otherwise. And the example I point to most often is suicide. Right? So if you take a large group of people and then don't allow them to interact socially, and then you also put them at risk in terms of how they're going to pay their rent, make their mortgage, buy their food, and then you're going to fix it so the thing that you did in the first place yields all kinds of shortages that you didn't think of ahead of time, right? Is there enough food? Is there enough toilet paper? Come to find out was a really big one for a while there. Well, you've created a different kind of life for everybody when you said you must shelter in place. And that new kind of life will have attendant risks that you didn't understand before you made the rule. And okay, we're going to save some people from themselves. They're not going to get sick by going out because some of the ones who would have gotten sick would have in fact died. Stipulated. But now people are going to die for other reasons. And the other reasons, the unintended consequences, never get factored into the original equation. And it comes from this unicorn way of looking at government, right? That, well, all we need to do is have a rule and then everybody will follow it and everything will be fine. Well, guess what? All kinds of unintended consequences come with every rule that you make. Why? Because human beings think around things. And the minute they can think around what you intended, all kinds of new things come right up. And we see this over and over and over again. But yet, people fall for it every time. Nobody ever stops to think, all right, will our actions today make tomorrow worse than it would have been otherwise? And the answer to that question is sometimes they will, yes. Sometimes it will be much, much worse. And given the COVID-19 issue, I don't pretend to know the correct answer, but that's what separates me from the politicians, right? They all know deep in their heart exactly what the correct answer is. Me with my PhD and 40 years of study, no, I can't figure it out for the life of me. Take from that what you will. But when you think about it, what have we done? It looks like we've undermined the economy something to the tune of 35%. I think we have 36 million unemployed people right now. And if you don't think that's not, I assure you, that's coming back to haunt us later. How much? Don't know. But nobody stopped to think when we were shutting down the economy step by step that there would be a long-term problem. People started with this pie in the sky thinking, saying, well, we'll shut it down and then we'll open it back up again and everything will be fine. And what do you see right now? Disruptions in supply lines so deep that we can't get meat to market. We have 1 in 5 Wendy's in the United States can't sell hamburgers. Selling hamburgers is what Wendy's does. 1 in 5 can't get beef. Why not? Well, we'll leave the beef industry out of this. There are problems there, but there are other problems that nobody ever thought about. Problems like packing tape was non-essential.
Yeah.
Those styrofoam containers that you put the meat in, non-essential. And all the things you need to get meat to market that were non-essential now don't exist. And farmers are now destroying animals because it's more expensive to keep them alive and not sell them than it is to just kill them. What could be more pathetic than that? Nobody saw it. Nobody saw it coming, right? It's unintended. But unintended consequences are right out there. And it's an advertisement to keep government very simple and very straightforward. Because the minute you try to accomplish more, the unintended consequences multiply. And there comes a point when you really can't control them anymore.
And Congressman Thomas Massey, who works on a farm himself, is trying to pass the PRIME Act, PRIME Act, which is just a deregulation bill. It's not even saying government needs billions of dollars to do this thing that may or may not work. He's just saying, hey, let's increase the likelihood that we don't experience a shortage by allowing, I think it was the farmers themselves to directly sell goods to consumers or someone else in the supply chain. By the way, first of all, how is that a regulation in the first place? Why does there have to be a middleman that just raises the price for everyone? That's one of those where you don't even know things are more expensive because of the state. You see this with OSHA and the Food and Drug Administration and the EPA all the time. But that one I had no clue about.
Let me give you an even weirder example. Something that's not life-threatening, but have you ever stopped to wonder why automobile manufacturers don't just sell directly to the customer?
Why automobile manufacturers don't? Because the state requires a license to sell the machines over 500 pounds.
You are not allowed to sell. If you produce a car, you're not allowed to sell it. What the hell? I mean, really, what the hell? Why doesn't GM have its own car lot, cut out the middleman, offer me a better price on a car? Not that I would buy a GM, but you take the point. And this is one of the problems that Tesla's had, right? Their business model doesn't comport with the existing laws on these things, state to state to state. And we find all kinds of examples here where the government, either federal or local or state or local, decides what it is that you can buy and from whom. Well, what I want to buy is really my business and the business of the seller. It's a real simple thing. If you over near Phoenix have something I want to buy and I in Tucson have money enough to cover the transaction, really what role does government play here? And the correct answer in the real world is a big giant one. The correct answer from where I sit is none whatsoever. This is a transaction between us is the very definition of peaceful cooperation. It should be fostered at every turn. And yet the government will step in and tell us that we can't transact even if we both want to, and we've agreed on a price and a product. What the hell, right? And that this is where I come to most of the time. My rejoinder to almost everything when we get to the final point is, what the hell? And I never get a particularly good answer from anybody. It just seems that everybody takes as an article of faith that, of course, the government has to have its fangs into every interaction between human beings that it can possibly have. And if you think about it, even our personal relationships are regulated by government. You can't get a marriage license unless the government approves. What the hell? Seriously, what the hell? Right? And
that'll be the name of your next book, or you should have a segment at the end of every news hour, just because there's new examples every day. I just came across one. The city of a city in California outlawed tiny houses for $1,200 because they didn't qualify as residents. So Elvis Summers, you can watch my video, what's the #1 cause of homelessness? He was building houses for $1,200, making homeless people have houses. And Eric Curran Price was the politician who said these need to be outlawed. Anyways, we're working on an anti-poverty bill. So the state seized the tiny houses, took people out of their homes, and says we're working on a poverty bill that's $1.87 billion. So they could rent seek, obviously. That was a couple videos ago. You could find it on my channel.
Let me offer it right now. What the hell? What's your tolerance for foul language on your podcast here?
Unlimited, total freedom.
You know, when Anthony and I started Words and Numbers, it's our podcast. We decided early on that it was going to be about a PG-13 kind of thing, and that, of course, bothered me because I work blue most of the time. I have what my mother called terrible potty mouth. And I wanted to have a segment on the podcast called The Asshole of the Week. And that became the Foolishness of the Week, which is actually quite popular. People like the Foolishness of the Week. We didn't have it once because we had a guest who was very interesting. We just cut it. We got all kinds of hate mail. So the Foolishness of the Week makes people really happy. But it's not the Asshole of the Week, right? You really want something a little better for an Asshole of the Week award. And by the time we started the Patreon account, we started offering bonus material, I finally am able to offer the Asshole of the Week on a weekly basis. So this makes me happy. And I think I'm going to look up that politician in California because he might win this week. That sounds quite terrible. He sounds like quite an asshole.
Oh, yeah. Curran Price is his name. Let's say that I am someone who looks at the free market and has the Noam Chomsky response. I say in this free market, this capitalism, it puts profits over people. We need a government that puts people before profits. Professor, how do you respond?
Yeah, that's pretty stupid. Pretty stupid. And Noam actually is in the building next to mine over at the university. So I see him from time to time. I sometimes want to ask him to explain himself, but then I realize I would have to listen to the explanation, and I'm not quite sure I want to do that. When you think about markets, and this is the thing that most people who are suspicious of markets miss. When you think about markets, what you're really thinking about is what you and I were talking about just a moment ago. You're thinking about human beings making choices. That's what markets are. So if I decide, I'm trying to think of the last thing that I purchased, given that I can't leave the house, the answer is not much. I just make something up. If I decide to purchase a new guitar, and I've decided, well, I can't afford the new price in the showroom on these things, I'm going to buy used. I can log on to this thing called Reverb and look at all kinds of people who offer things for sale, and they specify a price, and I can click through and say, all right, I really like that Les Paul you've got for sale, but I don't like it at $2,700. So I like it at $22,000. And then the seller can decide whether he wants to accept that offer or counter it or tell me to go pound sand, right? This is what a market looks like. It's the gentle give and take, again, between human beings as they look to cooperatively reach an end goal. Him selling, me buying, him making a profit, me not getting rooked, right? There's all kinds of things that you factor into this. And it's the same kind of thinking if you want to expand it a little bit, that I have when I walk through the aisles at the local Walmart. Right? I walk through the aisles, I look at the things on offer for sale, and I either decide, yes, I want that at that price, or no, I don't want that at that price. And it's a calculation that I make on the fly. And then you walk into Walmart and make the same calculations looking at things, but from your perspective. And you might want things that I don't, and I'll certainly want things that you don't. But if we all walk past the ribeye steak, which is in all of our opinion overpriced, something amazing is going to happen. Walmart will either lower the price or stop offering it altogether. Isn't that something? Government not involved at all. All that matters is the give and take that we all have. So how is that? How on earth is that destructive at the level of the individual? The individual only wins here, right? He gets more things for less over time. And if you take a look at the sorts of things that we now take for granted, go ask your grandparents what their lives were like. Just ask them. They'll laugh at you if you tell them that somehow they had it better than you did. That will be ridiculous to them. Now, they may say things that grandparents say. In my day, kids were better for the following reasons, and they'll bitch and moan about that sort of thing. But did they have air conditioning in their homes? No. Did they have, an almost inexhaustive amount of entertainment coming directly into the house? No. Did they have cars that they would not die in if they had a very significant traffic accident? They did not. And you start looking at all the things that the free market has given us, and it's astonishing how much better life is now than it was just 2 generations ago. I'm just asking you to think about your grandparents. That's roughly 40 years. Go back 60, 80, 100, and it's ridiculous how much better life is now than it was then. And when people like Chomsky, and I use him as a stand-in for an entire group of people, when people like Chomsky say things like, oh, life is so much worse, people care about profits, not human beings, how are we worse off exactly? Your house is bigger, it's safer, it's more comfortable. Your car is better, safer, more comfortable. Notice the trend, right? Your workplace is probably pretty good. How many hours a week do you work to make a living relative to people 80, 100 years ago? What's that work like? I wouldn't want to live my grandparents' lives. They were difficult. And I'm absolutely convinced that when I have grandchildren, if I do, they'll say the same exact thing, because this kind of progression just keeps right on going. And it's a bit of a miracle if you think about it. And this is one of the reasons why I and in our capacity together, Anthony and I, rarely, if ever, use the word capitalism. It's not what we care about. What we care about are free markets. And those are different sorts of things. We want markets to be free. We don't want to think about the role capitalists play. We want to think about the role markets play. And it's our very considered opinion that free markets lift all boats, right? Everybody's better off. The rich are better off, middle class is better off, and the poor are better off. Everybody's better off. So really, if we're going to complain about this, if Noam walks around, and again, using Noam as a stand-in, if Noam walks around saying things like, the free market is somehow destructive to the poor, explain to me why the poor keep getting richer every year, right? The rich get richer, no doubt about it. The poor also get richer, and there's equally no doubt about that. So are you telling me you'd rather have a system in which the poor didn't get richer? Really what we're looking at here is a certain form of jealousy, that people believe that, yes, the rich do get richer, and the level is really quite astronomical. And somehow that difference between how much richer the rich get and how much richer the poor get is problematic. Me, I don't think it is. I think as long as the poor keep getting richer, we've got a good thing on our hands, and we should be very happy we've got it. We should not cast aspersions. And, you know, there's one thing, it came up, I think, a day ago. Somebody posted in an ill-advised post on Facebook that if the Walton family, the family who owns Walmart, if the Walton family gave away their money, they could solve the problem of hunger in the United States. And I said, well, take a deep breath here for a second, because Walmart has provided food at a cheaper price than its competitors for years. They've already gone quite a long way towards addressing hunger in the United States. But we forgot something, because in the United States, Walmart employs 1.5 million people. Walmart has provided 1.5 million jobs. What have all the people who complain about Walmart created? Have they created 1.5 million jobs? Have they brought cheaper groceries to market? And I would dare say, if you added them all up, they wouldn't come close to 1/10 of what Walmart's done. So where are you going to lay your bet? What's going to make us better off in the end? And I think the answer is very clearly markets. And the freer markets are, the better.
Yeah, there definitely is some sort of hatred of success. People were just saying, you know, by 2026, Bezos is going to be a trillionaire, which, first of all, is a lie. His company will be worth $1 trillion. But just like you said, with Walmart, this is not just a number that he picked like on a scale. It reflects the voluntary exchanges that customers made in exchange for excellent things like Cooperation and Coercion, today's book that I had delivered to me. I couldn't have bought this book, especially I bought it like a month ago and we were already on lockdown. So things like Amazon are incredible. So I just say, you know what? Let's sacrifice Bezos to the god of statism and take all $1 trillion from him. That is going to cover about 4 months of the U.S. federal government. So now that we've killed one of the greatest entrepreneurs that's ever lived, that's given more people books, access to education than any other person on the planet has, and you've gotten a couple months of government, and you haven't solved the issue because government still spends it.
We did some this not too long ago, and if you not taxed but confiscated all the wealth of every billionaire in the United States, you could fund the U.S. government for about 7-8 months. Every billionaire, every single one.
Well, and also government expenditures are going to increase when they know that money's coming in. So it's not even going to be 7 months.
And you can only get it once, right? Because once you confiscate the wealth, they're not making any more.
Yeah, once you've killed the golden goose, guess how many golden geese you have? Goose egg.
You start to realize the role that envy plays in American politics, and I think it's sad, but more importantly, it's destructive. And somebody else's success is not your failure. Your failure is your failure. Your success is your success. And to understand that, I think, is to make our politics a lot healthier. But most people don't understand that right now.
And I really think getting to positive and negative rights also gets at the heart of people not being envious and appreciating things. Because when you look at it as if I have only positive rights, well, Walmart owes me a lot. They owe me healthcare. They owe me education just by existing. But if I understand reality and am a moral person who believes only in negative rights, I say, they offer me something, they owe me nothing. So if they offer me something, I have the right to take it or seek a better position. I actually worked at Walmart when I was completely broke. I had no car. I had to walk. And I wasn't getting paid much, but I got my foot in the door and I got to have a job. And now I'm way better off because of it. Thank God they were there to give me an entry-level position when I didn't have many skills at all.
Yeah, I remember the jobs I once had, right, that most of the whiners in the United States right now would say are somehow beneath the dignity of a human being. Well, I'm here to tell you there's no such thing as a job that's beneath your dignity if you need a job. And those things, the things I did once upon a time, and they were admittedly quite horrible. I did not enjoy them the way I enjoy certain things now. But I had to work very hard to get where I am now, right? I paid a price, and that's how life works. You get your foot in a door, you work your ass off, and if you do it well, You get to achieve more and greater things over the years. And what I see now are, people graduate from college with idiotic degrees, and then they say stupid things like, well, I should be an executive somewhere. No, pumpkin. At 22 years of age with an idiotic college degree, you get to be entry level, just like everyone else. And you can claim that that's not fair, and you can whine about it all you want, but that's not going to change the facts. So get to work real hard, sacrifice a little bit. You'd be amazed where you might end up. And I'm not really talking about the Horatio Alger myth, right, where you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps wherever you are. I'm talking more about the Horatio Alger story, where hard work, perseverance pay off over time. You don't get to win the minute you decide you're going to play the game. You get to win when you deserve to. And sadly, some people will deserve to win and won't. Other people will deserve to lose and won't. There's not perfect fairness in the world, right? Life ain't fair. But life is mostly fair. And hard work is the currency that pays off over time. So get on it and stop whining. For crying out loud, stop whining. You live in a place where most people in the world would literally give almost anything to end up. Right? People all over the world are trying like hell to get here, to live in this place that people say is fundamentally flawed and unfair. Well, why does everybody want to come here, and why does nobody want to leave here once they're here? Right? You get very few Americans year in, year out who say, screw it, I'm going to go live in some other country forever. That tells you something. It tells you a lot, actually. I don't know what the problem is in the end, because the lesson is so painfully obvious, but there we go.
Sure. And it's important to have an atmosphere of freedom and trade, because you can be, say, a woman in Nicaragua or Nigeria who you can work really, really hard. But if you don't have access to capital or a free market or people to trade with, well, then as hard as you work, you're going to consume everything you produce and have nothing left over. So if we look at, I was going through fee.org, and the countries that they compare are North Korea versus South Korea, East Germany versus West Germany, Botswana versus Zimbabwe, and Chile versus Venezuela. If we go on the same continent and look at freer markets versus more coerced markets, more command state-run economies, in every case, the poor are better off when there's more freedom. So my question to you is, how do we know this is a causal result of free markets?
All right, so let's back up a second. There are perfectly good reasons to compare the ones that are listed there, right? Because what do you get if you compare the United States to North Korea? That's an inapt comparison, right? It's not the correct comparison. The demographics are off, the climate is off, geography is off. Literally everything is different from place to place. But when you compare North Korea to South Korea, that's a political decision from 1945 that set them on two different trajectories. They're the same people, it's the same place, they have the same conditions, and it's the difference of a choice. Well, what do you see when you look at it? South Korea is actually a fully flourishing place. You can go to Seoul, Korea, and not see a difference in any meaningful respect from any of the great cities of the world, right? So New York City, Seoul, Paris, London, these are all more or less the same kinds of places, the kinds of places where a lot of people live and utterly flourish. What's the great city from North Korea? Oh yeah, there isn't one. Well, there kind of is, but the only people who flourish there are people who are in government or who are in the higher echelons of the military, because it's an authoritarian dictatorship. That's what authoritarian dictatorship. There's no mystery here, right? East and West Germany. What did East Germany look like just a couple of years after World War II? It looked like a place you wanted to escape, and that's what people
So they built
did.
the wall.
They built the wall, and people still try to get around it, over it, under it, right? Any way you could. There's another one that you didn't mention, and that would be Haiti and the Dominican Republic, right? They share an island. There's no big, huge difference between those two places. But if you had to live in one and not the other, you're going to go to the Dominican Republic every single time. Every single time. So what you see when you look at these apt comparisons, right? Comparisons that look at similar people in similar places, occupying the same geography, the same timeline, the same history, that's a lot. When you look at those examples, the more free places are very livable. The less free places are more like prisons. What more do you need to see? What evidence is there that you're not willing to look at, right? Because you'd have to be an idiot. I mean, you'd have to be a moron to wake up and say, really, I would prefer to live in North Korea over South Korea. What the hell's wrong with you? Right? How resistant to evidence must you be that you would extol the virtues of North Korea? Up until about 12, 15 years ago, there were pretty persistent rumors of cannibalism coming out of North Korea. The famine was that bad. Now, things have gotten better, thankfully, and the people seem not to be living under those dire sorts of conditions. But actually, we don't know, because it's so buttoned down that information rarely makes its way out. Remember when their dear leader just a month ago, everybody was reporting that he was dead. And then they were reporting that he was gravely ill. But then they were reporting that he was opening a new factory, cutting the big red ribbon with the big scissors, right? We can't even find out his health in the news media with any accuracy. Is that the kind of place you want to live? The kind of place that controls the flow of information both in and out? Well, I don't know anybody who is lining up to go immigrate to North Korea. I see evidence that there are a number of people in North Korea who want to get to South Korea very desperately. And you find that everywhere you look, right? In the German example, from the 40s up until the end of the Cold War, to this very day, everywhere you look where comparable people live in comparable places, and yet they've made one decision, it's always obvious what that decision will yield over time.
Yeah. There is definitely even an argument for, well, people say, well, what about Sweden and Japan? So I'm not advocating full North Korea, but places like Japan and Sweden. If you look at Japanese people and Swedish people in America, they're better off than they were previously in those other places. Or how about Cuban immigrants? Thomas Sowell says a large percentage of Cubans left Cuba when Castro took over after Batista, and those 1 million Cubans now have more wealth collectively in America than all of Cuba today. So, I mean, we're absolutely stealing people's future when we don't recognize the moral legitimacy of cooperation and how coercion is just antithetical to how humans should live.
Yeah, no, and I would go a step further. I'm sure Anthony said the same thing when he came on. Look, some small degree of coercion is absolutely necessary. And I can hear the libertarians out there howling at the moon as I say these words, but it's obvious some coercion is absolutely necessary, if only to create the regime that protects property rights. So there's some coercion going to have to manifest in order to accomplish that. But after that, very little coercion is necessary. Now, I think we need simple declarations. You should drive on the right-hand side of the road and not the left, right? This is not a choice that's open. We have to pick one or the other. We're reasonable people here. We have a certain percentage of our population who will literally never be able to care for itself. Well, we're going to have to take care of that to some degree or another, right? And I'm just speaking in broad generalities here, but if you think we should live in some kind of Randian paradise and people should be left on the curb to die, I'm going to take issue with that. No, they should not be. There are people who literally can't take care of themselves. I know this because I spent 10 years of my life working in mental institutions. I met them there, right? There has to be some kind of minimal safety net. But beyond these very minimal sorts of things, you got to leave people alone. You've got to let them live their lives according to the standards that they themselves have, as long as they do it in a peaceful manner that harms no one. As long as you're peaceful, we should have no quarrel with you. As long as If you destroy a life and it happens to be your own and no one else's, we still have no quarrel with you, right? As long as you're not harming someone else, I think we should leave you alone, and I mean completely.
And would you consider something like even those safety net courts or defense services? Couldn't those be funded voluntarily in some way? What I'm thinking of is if I need defense, does that mean any security agency has the right to forcibly take money so long as they defend me? Or does anyone have the right to take some money from me coercively so long as some of it goes to the poor or some of it goes to educate people? I'm totally for safety net. I'm a big safety net guy. We have the St. Thomas Food Bank on Thomas and 43rd Street in Arizona we always go to. I'm huge with helping people. I'm just against coercion for all people, even if they're in the government. Is voluntarism and self-defense, is that something you or Anthony would maybe consider?
Yeah, Anthony considers it a lot more than I do. And I consider it quite a lot myself. But there's this, I mean, you're butting up against now what would be the difference between a class. Liberals tend to look at the world and say things like, yeah, sure, military, whatever. And, you know, I follow very much in the footsteps intellectually here of Thomas Jefferson, of James Madison, right? Guys that really didn't have that big a problem with this sort of thing. But to go to the, I think the harder thing to deal with, right? Voluntarism and social welfare. The real problem, and the problem that Anthony and I argue over quite a lot when we get to this, or at least we did up until a couple of years ago, is that voluntarism is, I think, theoretically the absolute way, except for one thing. It doesn't guarantee you a successful outcome. So when you look at, when I say something like there are people who literally will never be able to take care of themselves, will other people step up and help? Yeah, actually they will. We've got thousands of years of human experience to yield to that conclusion. Charity does do quite a bit, and charity was the only thing that worked even in the United States. Right? We didn't have social welfare programs until very late in the day. But can charity guarantee a basic level of existence? And here the answer is no. And that's where the problem occurs. So if I say something like, we should take care of those who can't take care of themselves, I'm going to get wholesale agreement. Everybody's going to say, yes, we should. But then when we ask how that should happen, here's where the disagreements come. And notice, it's exactly the problem that we had with the other things. We all agree on the end. We just disagree on the means. So if charity worked in every instance, it would be easy to just say, well, there you go. But it doesn't. It doesn't work in every instance. And we need it to work in every instance when we're talking about human lives. If anything has to be respected in civil society, it's the value of a human life. And there's the problem, right? And now we're going to open the door to all kinds of things that reasonable people disagree about.
Sure. And my voluntarist response, just so the people are familiar with it, is yes, there is no guarantee under voluntarism, but there's also no guarantee under government. The fact that the state wants to take money in the first place doesn't necessarily cure people of a disease if they can't help for themselves. It doesn't necessarily produce food that a starving person might need. It doesn't necessarily produce a house or air conditioning or ventilators that individuals need. So I get that there's no guarantees and we can't afford to fall short. But us saying we can't afford to fall short doesn't necessarily mean this group called Congress gets a monopoly on coercion. I believe that's a non sequitur. And I just wanted to make my voluntarist position clear. This way you don't think you wasted an hour talking to a psycho.
Well, I might have. You might be a psycho for all kinds of other reasons. I think people with my position and voluntarists are in the same universe.
Unquestioningly, yes, absolutely.
And look, this brings up, let me just say one thing about the voluntarism angle. We do engage in quite a lot of coercion now to care for people. And you say there is no guarantee there, but I'm going to ask you how many people starved to death in the United States last year. And the answer is going to be approaching zero, right? So at least consider that maybe we catch the basics. I'm not willing to say that what we get is worth the cost. It might not be. And if a sensible person ran the show, we might be better off. But think here too about ends and means. I think this is the most important thing, right? We all, as human beings, have very similar end goals. We really want the same things. We're just cranking over the means, how best to accomplish these things. And if we could actually step back and give each other the benefit of the doubt just for a minute, right? I don't think my political opponents are evil. I think they're misguided. I think they're wrong. And that's a different argument, right? I can explain to you why I think you're wrong, and then you can weigh the evidence and decide if maybe I have a point or not. But if I start the conversation by calling you evil, there's really nowhere to go with that. I can't walk that back, right? And I don't think any of the people who I disagree with most strenuously, with maybe one or two exceptions, are evil. I think they're just fundamentally misguided. They're not thinking things through. They're not taking evidence into account, right? These sorts of things. And we're worse for it. For all the mudslinging, we're worse for it. And, you know, I can't make people stop it, but I can warn you that you better cut it out, because it gets a little more shrill every year. And what you see, even from people who are as close as you and I are in what we would do if we were given the authority to do it, even our in-group consistently makes the great the enemy of the good, right? We could accomplish all kinds of good things, but because they're not perfect, most of us will say, screw you, I'm going home. And you saw this, I think, perfectly with the Justin Amash presidential candidacy, which came and went before the ink was even dry on the page. He announces, okay, I'm really thinking about this. And everybody comes out from the libertarian universe and says, you're not libertarian enough. Oh, good God, he's so much more libertarian than any of the other categories that if you care about that sort of thing, you've got but one choice, and it was him. And instead of explaining all the reasons why he was an asshole and you don't like him, maybe you should have thought about how much better this choice was, given your priors, than any of the other choices. But no. And he pulled out today.
Sure. And people, I'm sure, saw my previous videos with Justin Amash. Some issues I had with him, it stems from meeting him at the Institute for Humane Studies. So that was also personal and philosophical. I want to finish with a quote from Cooperation and Coercion, page 12. Here the difference between government and society is laid bare. Government is a coercive tool society employs to achieve certain ends. Society, on the other hand, is the aggregation of people themselves and is generally cooperative. Mr. Harrigan, one final question I have for you. What is one book you would recommend to someone interested in your field, philosophy?
Yeah.
That's not written by you, because I've already I can't recommend Cooperation and Coercion enough. It's great on the entry level. It discusses principle and economics, unintended consequences. It's excellent.
Yeah, we tried to present the material in such a way in that book that a well-educated non-expert could read it, understand it, and then go do some more work later. We're not looking to confuse anybody with technical jargon or anything of the kind. But if I could only recommend one book, and if the goal was to understand pragmatic politics, maybe, because I have two favorite books and I have to cut one off in order to recommend one, I would recommend The Federalist, written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay in 1787 in the form of newspaper articles in support of adopting the new Constitution. So you get two separate things when you read the book as a scholar, as a serious human being. You get an argument about republicanism generally and what that means and what it requires and what it yields. And then you get an argument about this republic, the one we were given. and what that means and what that might yield over time. So there are two parts to the book, right? There's a more theoretical part and a more practical part. And you can get actually quite a lot from it. I think that's the book I would recommend every time. My other favorite book is Plato's Republic, which is infinitely more complicated, and you're going to have a lot of prior knowledge about a lot of other things to even walk into that book. But The Federalist, somebody who's relatively well educated knows the basic sweep of American history, not in any granular detail, but the sweep of it, can walk into that book and walk out of it knowing a lot more. So I would encourage people to give that one a look.
Sure. And I'm actually going to finish on a quote by one of your articles that you co-authored with Anthony Davies. It really reminded me of Bert Folsom's Political Entrepreneurs versus Market Entrepreneurs. You write, there are only two ways a business can obtain profit. One is to offer customers products they like so much that they willingly hand over their money. The other is to offer politicians favors, contributions, and considerations they like so much that they take the consumer's money and to hand it over to the businesses the politicians prefer. James, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. Everyone, please check out Cooperation and Coercion to understand the principles and economic case for a free society. Take care.
And we'll come back when we write What the Hell. It's good talking to you today.
See ya.